Hello, it's Stephen Bedard. One of the primary reasons that I am a Christian is that I believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I don't just believe that Jesus rose in the hearts of the disciples. I don't believe that his memory was just so real that it felt like he was still there with them. I really believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that he died on that cross, and on the third day he came out of that tomb. But it's a fair question to ask, why do I believe in the resurrection? Because that's not something that happens every day. You don't expect to find people coming back to life. We're not talking about someone who is drowned or has been frozen and then is somehow able to be resuscitated. We're talking about someone who was killed in a very violent way, left in a tomb by themselves, and was able to walk out of there at a time when there really is no natural explanation for that to happen. So why do I believe in the resurrection? Well, a lot of it really goes back to a passage in 1 Corinthians 15. And it's the Apostle Paul that's writing, but it seems as if he is quoting an earlier creed. And so some scholars have dated this creed to within a couple of years of the events being described. And so 1 Corinthians is a fairly early letter of Paul, which would be impressive enough. But the fact that he is quoting something much older than that is telling us something about how important the resurrection was to the early church. So I'm going to read it to you and then explain from that why I believe that the resurrection happened. This is what Paul says at 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. So what this is saying here is that the resurrection of Jesus was not something that was just seen by one or two people. You can imagine that Peter, having been so close to Jesus, and of course being devastated by the guilt that he felt about denying Jesus 3 times, you can imagine that the psychological stress that he was under. And there are New Testament historians who would point to this as a natural explanation of what happened, that Peter was just overcome with guilt, and the pressure on him made him see what he wanted to see, which was Jesus. And you know what? If it was only Peter, I would think that that would be a fairly reasonable way at looking at things. But it wasn't just Peter. So what else is it saying here? Well, it's saying that Jesus did appear to Peter, and he appeared to the 12. And it's interesting here that the 12 and the apostles are given as distinct categories, which may surprise you because you might think of them as being exactly the same. Really, the 12 are a smaller group of the apostles. There are a number of other people in Acts that are listed as apostles, but are not a part of the 12. So all of the 12 are apostles, but not all the apostles are 12. And so all those who were in the inner core, they saw Jesus, but also this larger group of apostles, they saw Jesus. And there is this group of more than 500 that had seen Jesus. Now, it's pretty unlikely that over 500 people are going to hallucinate the same thing. Again, if it was just 1 or 2, maybe I could see that, but over 500. And the way that Paul is sharing this is he's making it sound as if you could just go to Jerusalem and start asking around, and you will bump into some of these people. Some of them had died by that point, but many of them were still alive. And so if you weren't sure if Jesus had risen, ask around. You can talk to these people and you can get the answers that you are looking for. We're also told that Jesus appeared to James. Now, this James is not one of the 12. This is the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. And we see in the Gospels that James is not a believer. And yet it seems as if this is the event that changes James forever. Because when we look at the Gospels, he's not a believer. When we look at Acts, not only is James a believer, but he's the head of the Jerusalem church. How did that happen? A resurrection appearance. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation as Jesus talks to his brother and reveals himself after his death, saying, "Hello, I'm alive." Surprise. It must have been very interesting. And then, of course, Paul includes his own experience of the risen Jesus, which, when we look at what happened with Paul, the transformation of Paul, I don't know how we can explain this other than the fact that he experienced the risen Jesus. Because what happened to him is he burned his bridges to the Jewish community without having any assurance that the Christian community was going to accept him. In fact, it was looking unlikely for a little bit. And yet, Paul was willing to do this in a culture in which community was everything because he believed that he had met the risen Jesus. And so that's pretty strong evidence as far as I'm concerned. So eyewitness evidence for me is key to understanding how we can believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. And unlike what some critics might claim, there is no evidence that this is a later addition. This is not something that happened maybe 100 years later where people are thinking, well, Jesus was such a great guy, I hate to leave him in the tomb, why don't we raise him up? That doesn't seem to be the case. This seems to go back to the earliest traditions of the church. And of course, the disciples, the apostles, the 12, they ended up sacrificing their lives for what they believed. Now, I know the pushback, you're already thinking it, is that there are many people today who are willing to become martyrs for what they believe. But this is different. This is not just giving your life for a theological point that you happen to believe in. This is about them actually having seen the risen Jesus. This wouldn't be like me or you giving our lives because we believe Jesus rose from the dead. They had actually seen this Jesus. And if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if this is something they were just making up, then they are dying for something that they know is not true, which seems to be unlikely. Again, maybe it would happen with one or two people, but it seems to be consistent with the experience of the apostles, including James, the brother of Jesus. So to me, that is some pretty strong evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And that gives me a pretty solid foundation for being a Christian. I hope that that makes sense, and would love to hear your comments. Would love for you to visit me at my website, stephenjbedard.com, and hit subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and God bless.